there's one point where we're trying to get a YouTube to work, but I think I may just show you play the audio, because the audio has the main content on it. If we figure out otherwise, then we'll go that way. Oh, were you getting it or not?
I was going to try something
Oh,
else,
okay.
if you want.
We may still have it. Oops. I wanted to ask people if they, sorry, I'm still figuring out technology. I gave people out stories 1 through 4, so without just telling my stories, maybe I can have people read those in order. Does anyone have story 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
Riding the train into work Monday morning, Frank is thinking about the proposal he has to make today. He didn't sleep well last night and is concerned that if he doesn't do well, he won't receive the promotion he has worked so hard to get. Across the aisle, Jim's smartphone reminds him that it's going to be a long day with one meeting after another. He promised his son he'd be there for his soccer game, but now he's not so sure he'll be able to make it yet again.
All right. I'm not going to address these individually more. We just look at the collection of them, see if any of them sound familiar, either from yourself or a coworker. Somebody have number 2?
I do. Krista's stomach is in knots. Her boss is pressuring her to make some gray area compromises that go against her beliefs. She begins to wonder if she really is being too narrow-minded, as her coworkers have accused.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Connor. One thing you'll notice about these is some of them fall in one particular category and some in others. Maybe Connor's in the category that there is something maybe you can do. There are some workplaces where you can choose to change your workload, or maybe just get sort of a talk on the side if you go to your son's soccer game. Other ones where if you lose a big contract, there are more and dire and maybe other consequences. I don't have answers to any of these issues, but just to bring the issues up, that they're there and they're common, is something that we at least want to address and make less ambiguous. Someone at number 3?
Mark has to make a bid on a project, and he knows that his main competitor is going to underbid just to get the contract. To give an honest bid will likely mean he won't get the job. And as they say, there's no prize for second place.
I can speak from experience with this. I was part of a project once where somebody was actually put in that position and then actually spoke less than truthfully, and I knew that they spoke less than truthfully and didn't say anything. And I live with it to this day, and I tell my students it's not worth doing, okay? We got the contract, but I don't ever want to get a contract that way again, okay? And even though I can say I didn't say it, I was privy to it, and I was there knowing what was going on. So this is real stuff. Number 4?
Steve is a new Christian who is trying to figure out what his new faith means for his work in marketing and advertising. In an industry not known for its truth-telling, he struggles with his own conscience and what it means to live as a witness to Christ.
Yeah, we have a conscience. We're human beings. We have a conscience. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Heather. So if something is ambiguous, if there are these things where there is a conflict with your conscience, and with the conscience I'm going to mean that that's something more on your faith side, and I do also want to preface this, these things I'm going to talk about are not hard and fast, but your conscience is that, if you will, your conscience is always with you in your faith. If that's your faithful side, and then there's your responsibility side to work, when those things are in conflict, what do we do? And again, if I haven't said it, I have no answers here, okay? But the idea is to bring that conscience to work. Is it an oxymoron, okay? There are things that we say all the time, and they're mainly to bring about a reaction. And there was a sermon at Redeemer last weekend where Pastor Lisa Bates-Farland was talking about, the last 2 weeks, she was talking about calling and vocation. And then she was also talking about taking your faithfulness to work. And I forgot the exact statement that she made, but then the congregation laughed, as they do oftentimes with an oxymoron. So it was kind of clear, the clear, palpable feeling in the congregation was, oh yeah, take my faith to work. And she was talking about making a faithful decision in the context of someone's work. Not that we don't want to do it. It actually got these giggles and laughter because Because one thing I want to mention here is that there is a real palpable hunger for what to do in those situations. Okay, and that maybe we'll talk some about that too. What do we do in those situations? So in doing this, I'm also writing my notes, and I'm saying there's certain parts that you can skip over. But here, do you call it spirituality? Do you call it faith? Do you call it religion? One could do one of a number of things. But there are lots of movements in spirituality at work that are not grounded in, say, Christian faith strongly. It's perhaps more broad, vague, ambiguous. It includes people from other faiths and people from no particular faith. And I'm not going to use that word because there's so much written about it that's not sort of based in a Christian faith. So I'm just honing the topic in quite a bit, actually. And people have sometimes not used the word religion because organized religion sometimes has a negative connotation as being institutionalized. And there are people who want to have this discussion that when you couch it in terms of religion, they tune out. But faith is anchored both in God, the scriptural narratives, rituals, ethical teachings, and it recognizes both the general of spirituality, which people here can relate to, and the specific in terms of how you practice it in your particular denomination of religion. So I'm just going to use the word faith here. What's the setting? Now, even though I said I'm going to use the word faith, there have been ministries in workplace spirituality that became prominent even as long as almost 100 years ago. In teachings of the church, the theology of work, many denominations started taking a prominent position in the 1950s. But new movements have taken a foot since about the 1980s, okay? And they were born of a broad and pervasive disconnect between what I'm going to talk about as maybe a new paradigm of work and people having to make decisions, just like in these 4 stories, where they have a hunger for hearing from people that they trust, their fellow congregants, their pastors, and a message from the Word, from Scripture, that says, what do I do in this situation? That sort of bore out the Sunday-Monday gap. We hear one thing here. My father used to say, people act very nicely in church, and then they cut you off in the parking lot. So Monday starts pretty early sometimes, okay? But if not on Sunday, certainly on Monday, we go back and have a different maybe paradigm where we have to gear up our head a little differently. Why is that? People don't want to do that anymore. When I say people, it might not be everybody, but there is a growing sense that we want to live that Sunday into Monday, okay? So that's kind of a little broadly some of where we're coming from. I'm presenting this, there is no day and time where this happened. It's been a general thing, and I feel like maybe I offer one thing, and that's that there is, to me, not to me, in what I was reading, there was an old paradigm of work, and there's kind of a new paradigm of work, and I'm interestingly found myself placed in the middle. It's not, the commercials say it's not your dad's Buick, it's not my dad's workplace, and I learned my sense of work and service from my dad and mom. It's not their workplace, and yet I'm now in the workplace teaching people who I am their grandfather's age. So when I talk to millennials now, it's not like my dad talked to me. So my parents came from a post-World War II industrial era. Faith was, and like I said, these are not hardwired things, but they're what my experience was, and they're what people have written about. Faith was private, and it had no real place in the corporate boardroom or the corporate world. Government actually served as the model for the separation of your church life from your work life. And there, I have always been I thought this was a good, interesting point. This would be a whole topic in and of itself. I come from this background that the Founding Fathers said we have freedom of religion. We are not prescribed by our government to practice any one religion, and neither by work. But that's not freedom from religion. There are people who feel there should be no prayer in school. There are people who feel that freedom of religion, being able to practice anyone, means freedom from anyone. Okay? Those prepositions are very, very particular there. So they mean something here. There is a feeling now that work doesn't have to be a place free of faith. Okay? Free from any one faith, maybe, yes. Free from a prescribed faith, maybe, but not free of any sense of faith. Now, why does this have import? Because we work 40 to 60 hours a week, 48 to 50 weeks a year for 40 years. Do the math, it's 80 to 120,000 hours of your life. okay? Typically, employees spend 63% of their waking lifetime at work, and it's the best hours in your day, and it's the best years of your life. That's why people have this feeling. Now, what is work? Well, it's about people's seeming sense, and this is still about 8 years old now, but the Pew Research Center and some national HR studies asked people what their workplace was like. 60% said it was secular, 30% said it was somewhere in the middle, and 10% said it was religious, a religious-based organization. Yeah?
I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact with, people have the old saying of, when I'm at work, I don't talk about two topics, and it's religion and it's politics.
Politics, right, exactly. And I'm going to play a little clip from one of my favorite movies that has somebody who says exactly that. So now, a person who's smart about how they do that can actually get people to talk about those things and maybe even affect a change at work. I sometimes think really, they're not sly, they're just sharp about how they do it. Really wise leaders can do that too, but it's very difficult to do, it takes a lot of practice, and we can do it at the grassroots level, but it's not easy to do. When you first mention something like that, you've opened Pandora's box, either religion or politics for sure, okay? People probably know, and I'm going to try not to do what speakers sometimes say, that you all know that. Well, in certain instances, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced situations just like that. And sometimes in talks like this, I have to avoid a certain topic that I think is really germane, but it's going to set people off and it's going to take the conversation totally somewhere else. And 8 out of 10 times, that's something political or something about a particular faith. Okay, we don't want to do that, not now. But I understand why they say that at work, okay? But work has changed. A lot of people are experiencing that. The stability of work and the so-called contract of a work for life is rarer anymore, and that's being kind. Some people just say it's gone, okay? And this leads people to have a search for not having their faith be in the support of the corporate world, but they look for some kind of security from someplace external to the corporation. And people have always done that in their church life, but work is more precarious and discontinuous, meaning my dad had a job for life as a retail pharmacist. I've had 2 main jobs in my life, but millennials are going to have 6 to 8 jobs in their career, okay? So when in particular, now I'm going to be a little political, and then I'm going to really fastly retreat from it. One thing I support is now taking health benefits at work and making them not specific to a particular employer, because we're moving from employer to employer to employer. And you develop a condition, you come to another job, and now it's a pre-existing condition. Well, it isn't pre-existing. Of course, everything in your life is pre-existing from the moment it happens. So if we take the old model and try to apply it to the new paradigm, there are parts of it that don't work, okay? People feel the moral significance of their work. In larger numbers anyway, they feel it matters less. Americans tend to put in more hours at work than any of their global economic peers. And recent studies by the Pew Research Center found that Americans dislike their work in larger and larger numbers. And the big numbers are that more than half say they're dissatisfied. And that's highest amongst people ages less than 25 and the midlife crisis, I don't like that word, but the midlife reconsideration years, 45 to 60. Okay. So I'm in this, and I'm just at the high end of the speed limit here. And you're asking, these people are asking very different questions. They're dissatisfied for very different reasons than people here. Okay? And so with all these things, it's, and let me point out one more. Here's the Pew Research Center findings. With all of this, not finding that consciousness necessarily in the work ethic, and going from job to job to job perhaps, we have to reckon that with the fact that the people who said this are, by and large in this country, 78% of them practice a Christian religion, 5% practice some other faith, institutionalized or otherwise, and 16% are people who may be highly spiritual, not spiritual at all, atheists, or the nuns, as Pastor Matt and Dan Weiss often refer to them as. And this is the construct. So we are predominantly, in this country, a Christian workforce that's feeling all these disconnects. So now here
Do you want me to try it?
I'm just going to unplug this. Now here is the mentioning politics or religion piece, and I did this once, and I don't know if Evie and Robin remember. I actually said at Mount Zion that this was a great movie to watch, forgetting there was some pretty harsh language. So people I know would not be comfortable with harsh language came to the next week, we watched that movie, and I go, great, and they go, you didn't tell us. And I, okay, there are some out-and-out fights in this movie about these things, but this one's clean, but it has all the elements of what I wanted to have you hear. So the context of this movie is that it's called The Big Kahuna. It's based on a play by T.S. Eliot called The Cocktail Party. And the really cool thing is there's three characters: a young, fresh newbie at work, a pretty established mid-career person, and then the elder statesman. And what T.S. Eliot then told people in literature classes on his play is that this is the same man. This could be the same person at three stages of their life talking to each other. So this is the middle-aged guy going after the big contract for industrial lubricants in Wichita, Kansas, talking to the young man who found the big rich man who was going to offer the contract, but instead of talking about lubricants, talked about Jesus. Okay, in a moment of weakness. Actually talked about Jesus and his dogs. So he related to him on a personal level. Okay, so there's no video, but that's okay. We'll just listen to it, okay? And if you get to watch the movie and you wanna, I can tell you what parts to skip if you want, but this is a great scene.
If we're nothing but functions here, then why don't they just send robots?
They don't send robots, Bob, for the simple reason they haven't invented one yet. The day comes when they can build a robot to do what we do and make it work, then that's exactly what they'll do precisely. But until that day, they send us. They say,
Turn it up.
Larry, Phil, why don't you go on down to Wichita for a couple of days? Don't
It's
worry
as loud
about
as
the
it
room
goes,
board.
sorry.
We'll take care of that. And for a couple of days, Bob,
Go louder.
all right, Wichita. And we become the hands of the company, shaking all the other hands before us. What you did, the reason you were insincere, is that you cut off that bond. It would be like the hand just sort of breaking away from the arm and saying, oh, you know what, I have this other thing out here to do that has nothing to do with you. Oh, Sid, please don't do that. I'm trying to have a conversation with you. Don't bring the Apostle Paul in. I'm trying to do something else.
I don't see how we can have a conversation like this if I'm not allowed to bring up the subject of God.
We're not talking about God. I'm talking about something bigger than God.
Bigger than God?
An issue, Bob, is not your belief in God or your desire to spread that belief. An issue is what we're here to do.
Which is what, Larry? Which is what?
We're here to sell lubricants, Bob. Industrial lubricants. We're not here to save souls.
So industrial lubricants, Bob. We're not here to save souls, okay? We're not here to talk politics. We're not here to talk to the big contract, big kahuna about his dogs or his kids or Jesus or to save sin. Now, you notice how he turns that into saving souls, okay? So he wasn't trying to save the man's soul, but he turned it into something like that. Like if we let a little religion in the workplace, it's going to take over the whole place. So at the end, I have something to add about that. When the Pew Research Center did studies about companies that allowed religious expression and the observance of religious holidays into the workplace, the fears of a lot of people that people would proselytize toward them and evangelize toward them and make them very uncomfortable, by and large, 9 out of 10 times, that does not happen. So the facts speak to the issue that the things we're afraid of about taking religion to work, from a personal, interactive, one to another colleague point of view, don't usually pan out. A lot of better and good things happen. Matter of fact, the two things that happen, by and large, it's not workplace productivity. That's the third, okay? The first one is the interactive collaboration of people goes up, and the second thing is collegial morale goes up. Staff morale goes up. And those things usually parlay into people doing a better job, okay? So things we're afraid of about this aren't always things that we can understand from the perspective that they're right, okay? I titled this, Where are the Answers? And then I don't have any. So I want to preface everything. I don't have answers. I find myself in this quandary, and I ask myself, where are the answers, okay? When I ask people, When pastors ask people, and there are plenty in this church who are very successful in their business endeavors, but also deeply committed Christians, deeply committed faithful people, they said even the most deeply committed Christian business leaders and successful ones seem ill-equipped or unable to answer questions about the integration of faith into the workplace. Not because they don't want to, they just find they stumble on their own words. We don't know. This is not something that we have necessarily practiced before. So, now, some leaders have, but again, by and large, if most people had, we wouldn't have these numbers here, people feeling this disconnect from work and their conscience. And here was the harsh thing, and this came from a thesis at George Fox Theological University by a young man who said, you know, the church is missing a great opportunity here. So he wasn't trying to attack the church, he's just saying there's this tremendous opportunity for you to go out and tell people, equip them with, say, the understanding of how their faith should inform their work. Okay? And yet they had yet to develop a language to connect the post-industrial working world with religious commitment. By and large, they had avoided the subject, both laity and the religious and pastors. 90 to 98% of Christians, they found by surveys, were not trained, felt they were not trained to apply scripture in the workplace. And there was little to no seminary curriculum in faith and work. As a matter of fact, there was more in faith and science than there was in faith and work, which is another topic in which Pastor Matt and I are highly interested, and Dan has spoken to that too. But very little actual formal seminary curriculum about faith in the workplace. So this stuff, these facts, along with that palpable feeling in the beginning that we talked about, kind of breeds that there's a critical need for church and pastoral guidance. And that it's missing is not to fault the church, just that the working world has evolved to a place where it needs this. And the church has to recognize, and we as the church have to maybe ask for that. Okay? So that's where I'm kind of going with that. Then I looked at studies, and there were ones that had particular components to make to what they called faith at work ministries. This is something that the church could do, it felt, and it felt that when this person who did this thesis called Faith at Work at George Fox University went around and asked hundreds of congregations across the United States, and they found that the ones who were doing faith at work ministries were few, but they had three common elements to them. They were advocating a biblical understanding of call and vocation. They had an aspect called naming. Naming is when people name themselves as having the authority and influence over their own work. A lot of people feel they can't bring their conscience because they don't have that requisite responsibility that goes with authority, is the way I call it. You have an authority to make something happen. Excuse me, you have the responsibility to make something happen, but not the authority over those yourself you can delegate to and yourself to make it happen. That disconnect needs to be fixed. And there's a critical role for church as community. I can't tell you, the reason we're here 5 years is because we feel the sense of community at this church. And I felt it way quicker than I felt it even in the educational and academic field. Okay? There's a sense of community there, but it's not nearly as palpable as here, and I don't feel nearly as comfortable with it as I do here. So I'm bringing some of my own sense into this because I'm kind of feeling lost between my parents' generation and the generation that I teach. People that have written in the Spirit at Work phenomenon talk about 6 components of bringing a spiritedness to work. And that's that the workplace should value contribution, it should prize creativity, it should cultivate inclusive working, collaborative working amongst people. It should always work from a set of developed principles. I admire no managers of companies that I have met in Milwaukee more than I have people who say they started their companies. And I met people who started their own companies and said they were predicated on a set of inviolate principles. And those principles were going to outlast them in the company. We do that here with our faith. There are the commandments. There are things that we believe, by and large, we have to follow. Okay? And companies can change that on a dime for short-term interests, but those that have these principles tend to be able to be more comfortable with faith in the workplace. They promote vocation versus simply a job or an occupation, and it turns out they emphasize, and a lot of these actually emphasize sustainability and goodness to the planet. Okay? This church is actually one place that's doing that too, very actively. I happen to be involved in, from a participant point of view, not a leader, as there's an endowed chair at MSW in servant leadership based on Robert Greenleaf's studies from an original Hermann Hesse novel, where a servant, Leo, ends up being the leader and the protagonist in the story. And this notion usually has 12 components, but 4 of them I find are really important for integrating with the other ministries in there, that servant leaders tend to listen very, very carefully. They lead by serving, they build community, they empower. If it's a pastor like Pastor Chris is a servant leader. I've seen him in the kitchen washing dishes. He doesn't go until everything's done, okay? Now he's a leader in this way, but there are other places where a person of his place in the church is not in the kitchen washing dishes, okay? He understands everything that goes on here for no other reason that he's there most of the time. Servant leaders believe fervently in calling, even amongst people who are not laity, okay? They believe in collaborative authority and empowering their people to do things together. And they have a commitment to the development and growth of their people. Okay? The common factors amongst all these, and I also looked at, Lorna had given me a Jesuit business education journal. Okay? There are some facets in the Jesuit education of business leaders that are also factored into this last thing here. The common factors amongst all of them seem to be some guiding mission statement. I know mission statement can seem vague to people, but if it's detailed and it involves these inviolate principles, you can say yes to no or no to things more clearly if you have a well-defined mission statement. All of them promote vocation and calling. They're inclusive. They tend not to be as hierarchical and tend to be more flat organizations. And they believe in collaborative authority and development of their staff. Okay. Now, where do these things have any scriptural backing? I don't have this background to discuss this. I'm going from this one particular thesis that says this is what people are yearning, okay? And the 2 ones that are mentioned in various of the reports are Genesis 1-4 and 1 Corinthians. I have more of a feel for 1 Corinthians. I relate more to the New Testament than the Old Testament, but this thesis comes about and says that these are rich opportunities for pastors to preach on. In the first 4 chapters of Genesis, there's discussion of creation as 6 days of work, the importance of emptying the well on the 7th day. When do we have sabbatical? Every 6 years. After 6 years of work, take the 7th year, not off. There is a reason to empty the well to come back and work. The story of creation of humans to tend the garden, and then the falling from grace and division of labor amongst the sexes, and even so far as the first murder that occurs over a jealousy over someone favoring the fruits of one's labor over another. Okay? And in 1 Corinthians, there's a statement that there's perhaps no more practical guide in all the Bible to applying Christian faith on a day-to-day basis to work than 1 Corinthians. There are chapters and discussions on calling and career, service and leadership, fair wages, environmental stewardship, and my particular favorite, spiritual gifts, and bringing a spiritual giftedness to your work. Now, in this regard, let's see, in the book itself, in the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, there is specific reference to calling and need for common vision and God's use of ordinary people, all right within chapter 1. One of my favorites, that it takes all sorts. I try to live this at work, telling people it takes all sorts. When we have a faculty evaluation, I'm a very big fan of saying that it's too cookie cutter. It's too 50% this, 20% this, 20%. I'm supposed to be 20% something that's not one of my particular callings or vocations or strengths. And I say, what we do is, in our faculty evaluations, we violate that all the time. We say Chuck doesn't do department service, but he's a gangbuster on institutional service. Nobody does it better than Chuck. So if that's true, then why can't someone else do the department service? Now, that doesn't mean Chuck can put down department service, or someone who does department service can't put down someone who does institutional service, no more than the pancreas can put down the liver and the liver can put down the feet. The idea that there are parts to play and they're all different, and until we step back and see the big picture, I mean, I like the, then you can't comment. I like I'm not musically inclined, but I like the analogy of a symphony. So when one element is missing from the symphony, people who know the piece can hear it, okay? But if that one person plays their piece, that's not a symphony, okay? So this happens again and again. It takes all sorts to make a symphony. Takes a village, okay? Leadership is service, so certain leadership gets mentioned at the beginning of chapter 4. Now, some of these readings seem somewhat vague to me, but if you study them, then they come about to be a strong predicator of believing in these. And bloom where you're planted. Bloom where you're planted is big with me because some of these conditions of work being faithful don't exist in my realm of the academic world. And so if you can make a difference where you are by having one more element of the culture change. So this bloom where you're planted refers to me to, if you don't like the culture, change it. Bring the culture of your spiritedness and your inclusiveness and your conscience. Bring your conscience to work. And let it play out in your work and be an example to others, and you might be able to grow that garden from one seed at a time. Okay. So now, I think I gave someone a section on calling. I would ask, does someone have that reading from Corinthians? Okay. And then could you read just the biblical passage and then the thing to the right of it?
Sure. 1 Corinthians 1:17. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied for its power. We should focus on the things we have been called to do. Second verse, 1 Corinthians 1:26. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Called and gifted people come from all sorts of backgrounds.
Thank you very much. So here we have, it takes all sorts again, and you can bring your giftedness to some particular job prescription that doesn't call for your giftedness as a prerequisite. So let me give an example of that. And it's going to be a personal one again. I had a job where I had to talk about computer modeling to people who were very good experimentalists. And there's an old Einstein quote that everyone believes no one believes a model except the person who structurally put it together, and everyone believes an experiment except the person who performed it. So experimentalists can question out the wazoo, that's their nature. But modelers, and especially young whippersnapper modelers right out of school, someone who put a model of equations on a computer tends not to understand the real world and talking about it. So I felt like my calling was to educate people who did experiments about why modeling had some good aspects and bad aspects. So I was constantly putting disclaimers on models, telling them if anybody tells you to believe this without an experiment, I was almost taking their side. But in the end, when they said you were doing that, you weren't just teaching me about modeling, you were teaching me about what it's like for a modeler to work with an experimentalist. All the time, I was teaching, and I wasn't a teacher, okay? No matter what I did on that job, when I had interface between people, I tended to explain the aspect of one person's job to another in a way that they were able to digest it. And that's all I ever do in front of the classroom. Take somebody's thesis and bring it out and maybe chew it up and say, here's some of what you can digest out of this, what do you take from it. And some of the rich conversations come where people take off from that. So I'll ask people some questions maybe at the end and see if that happens. But, so this wasn't my job there to teach these people. My job was to present and to collect the data from them and compare it to a model. But I didn't feel like I could do that without doing what I naturally do. So if there's any aspect in your job where what you naturally do can be applied. Now I'm spoiled, I'm very much spoiled in that regard because I have a job that's tailored to that. If you have a job where you feel your calling is not tailored to that, there are still ways in which people uniquely bring, if they have the ability to bring people together, then even though they're not a negotiator, they can use their negotiating skills on the job in the context of what they do. And to a good manager, that will become apparent. Okay, so there is an aspect where God says if you're not in the right place at the right time, you still be who you are. Okay, so we talked about calling a little bit. American work culture, though, perceives calling and vocation typically as separate. I mean, if you ask people, although I think in this church, it's hard to go back and think of just the corporate definition, but if vocation is used in your workplace simply to be synonymous with career, occupation, or your job, that's something that a person in and of themselves decides, versus a calling where the general feeling is that it's religious perhaps and spiritual, and there's a source from outside that calls you. Okay, so when people talk about vocation, I'm not talking about the servant leaders, I'm just talking about people in perhaps industry and the working world may use the word vocation interchangeably with something that you decide. But your nature and who you are is, like Isaiah says, you were born and I called you by name. You have a particular giftedness. And there are some of us who feel like it's not maybe what we would like. I'd like to be able to sing, but I can't sing. I cannot particularly sing. I was asked to leave the only all-volunteer choir at Cornell University. And I was told, you know, there are other jobs at the chapel that you could do. And I've had my best friends in college who said, when they come to that point and they sing the high note, you know what to do, which is just be quiet. when I did that one time in the choir, the music professor who ran the choir said, because I stopped singing. So if you know there's things that are not your gift, well, then that's your burden too. But I try to use my gift where I do, no matter what I'm doing. Now, again, I'm spoiled that way. I don't have a job where that's very, very difficult to do. But if it is, I would want more help from the inclusive community and my pastor and their preaching to tell me how to do that. In a piece by Meeks called God the Economist says, our view of work won't change until we stop viewing our work as simply a commodity with some market value and start viewing it as being something that's inclusive with community and has a sense of personal dignity. These are the things that right at the beginning I said people lost in the new paradigm of work. We're working many, many hours and divorcing yourself from your family and everything else until work can become integrated with that again. Then the view of our work won't change. It won't go back to some of the goodness that we had given up by this other view. Okay. Before we go here, could I ask someone who had the second the piece from 1 Corinthians? Is that you, Lauren?
1 Corinthians 3rd chapter, 4th to 9th verse. For when one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos, then are you not merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted Apollos. I planted. Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to their labor of each. For we are God's servants, working together. You are God's field, God's building. And it means everyone has an important role to play in attaining the goal, and no one can take all the credit for doing so.
This is something that I experience all the time, and Lorna reminds me almost on a daily basis. I mean, yours is not to harvest, yours is to sow. Some of us are bows and some of us are arrows. Arrows are the ones that are shot out to do the deeds. Bows are people who prepare them and send them out. So as a teacher, really my calling is more as a sender, but yeah, I guess what? I'm jealous of the people who are arrows in a certain sense. I was an arrow at one time, but I'm a little jealous of wanting to be there somewhere 10 years in the future where the students say, oh, aha, that's what he meant by ... Well, the person who sows the seed doesn't always get to see the garden. What did Martin Luther King say? I can see the promised land, but I'm not going to get there with you. This is kind of a guiding mantra for you. I can see the promised land, but I tell my students, I'm not going to get there with you. You know, you're going to go out and do that. And I did just tell some people in the marketing department at MSOE, they said, well, you know, they were asking me what my feeling was as being a teacher, and I said, oh, I live for that statement that a student only once made to me, but I know other students have thought but not had the nerve to say, which is, and I was working with him, telling him, I wouldn't tell him what he was doing wrong, but I was guiding him to figure out what he was doing wrong. And the moment hit, only once in front of me, the moment I'm jealous about and want to hear, And finally, he just packed up his computer. I go, where are you going? He goes, I don't need you anymore. So, another professor was there and he goes, hurts, doesn't it? And I go, no, actually it's what you want to hear. It's what you want to hear, but you don't want to admit it, and you don't always want students to just, well, Jacob, you're the only one who can come out and say it. Somebody might think it, but you're the only one who's going to come out and say it, okay? So, so this notion that, yeah, it takes all sorts, and your job may not allow you to be there when something, one other part of the symphony takes place. You know, if you have a part that's leading up, it gets people to take deeper and deeper breaths, but you're not part of the crescendo at the end. The crescendo at the end only works because people are exhaling. And they only exhaled because your little piece got them to inhale along the way. So you kind of feel like you're not there for the big shebang, but you set it up. You're not there for the harvesting, but there's no harvest without the seeds. So it's kind of learning to think that way. And then coming to church on Sunday and hearing, that's okay. So anyway, so the three things, let's see if I can just hit them real quickly. Calling is biblical understanding, and I thought no one said it better than Buechner. There are different kinds of voices calling people to do different kinds of work. And the problem is separating what's the voice of God from what's the voice of the society or the company, right? The company says there's this thing for you to do, and your problem, Bob, is you broke off and listened to this other voice, okay? And also the superego, the voice of me. I want to be there. I want to be there to see when they get it, you know. But that's not my calling. So by and large, Buechner's good rule is if you want to find the kind of work that God usually calls you to do, you do what you need most to do. Parker Palmer says it a different way. Do the thing you can't not do. When I was working in industry, I couldn't not teach. No matter what I did, people came up to me and said, well, you're teaching. In essence, you're doing what a teacher does. And I didn't listen to that voice for a long time. And then I said, well, it just seems to be something I do, whether I'm asked to do it or not. And the world needs, and intersect that where the world most needs to have it done. And I feel like maybe I'm in a place now where the world most needs to have it done, but I also believe in a lot of ways we're not doing it right. So I teach, but I don't believe we're doing it right. So what do I have to do? I'm stuck in this place where we're trying to do what we want to do, and even my company says this is what we want to do, and yet when I bring my Sunday into Monday, there's a lot of conflict. I say, we can do this so much better if, ... And I think people feel that at their job. I know why, because when they sit down and have a drink with you on Friday, when they bring their kids over and their kids are wrapping up something and you're talking to them, these subjects come up again and again and again. In particular, if you're just coming from work and something like that happened. Okay, so these are what we read. So people would like to know, and sometimes I seldom hear a preached sermon like that, but I've heard a preached sermon that described the situation I was in at work and then gave some guidance about what maybe the right thing was. And the right thing isn't always to stand up to the company and get fired. Some people, like I said, are in a much more precarious position where if they don't get the contract, they're released. Okay, you can lose your job. I'm in a much more protected situation, so it's safer for me to experiment. But that's not true for everybody. So what do you do? My brother, for instance, is a tax accountant, and his two last jobs that he left, his bosses were indicted for fraud. Not because he hangs out with felons, but because he didn't find this out about them until after he worked there. And my brother, like me, for all our faults, he's as honest as the day is long. He will not cross that line. And he told me, I'm worried about going to jail. So this is real. This is absolutely real for some people, okay? Naming is having the authority. My brother didn't have this. He did not have the authority to tell people, I won't do something illegal, okay? But naming in the Bible is not just a label. Naming is a sense of character and essence. Saul was renamed Paul. Jacob was renamed Isaiah. I'm naming you because your essence is of this thing, okay? But naming in this particular sense is the idea that you have the authority to do what it is you're responsible for doing. Now, this is important because this is where the church can really help. Work is one of the most important settings where we accomplish what we can't do alone. If we could do it alone, sometimes some workplaces feel that's what telecommuting is. But good telecommuters don't work in isolation. They may work at home, okay? And there may be very good reasons because the rest of our work-faith model isn't working, per se. But that's an attempt to fix something that's wrong with the system. But in general, when you look at really interesting companies like Pixar and Apple, and even the Center for Advanced Study at Princeton, they create workplaces where people naturally flow amongst each other. Because in this flow, there's this transfer of information. At the Advanced Study Center where Einstein studied, there were blackboards and whiteboards in the hall and the elevator. So maybe you don't want to go that far, okay? Apple, Steve Jobs put bathrooms only on the first floors. Everybody had to constantly go through the halls to get to the bathroom, and he only changed it when a woman became pregnant and said, you just can't do this. I cannot go 5 flights down to the bathroom. So that was fine, and she already interacted with enough people. But the idea is the synergism of walking back and forth. When departments at our school are separated amongst buildings, we literally don't see each other. We should, and everybody goes, oh, people will do that. But you know what? When you're together, you see that happens. So collaborative authority. Being together and having the authority to say to yourself, I don't have to go ask Pastor Chris if I can do this. I may need some money, and yes, I have to ask for that, but I don't have to ask Pastor Chris because he's empowered us, and Pastor Matt has empowered us. Okay? So empowering of the ladies, an example. Again, I tell students, take ownership over your project. Don't ask me. Go do something. Now, of course, they did that. The first thing a student did was ask a regent, board of trustee member for money, which is illegal. So that's when I got called in. They go, he said you told him to do whatever he told. Did I say that? Okay. I have a golden, really, it's a cheap thing from Goodwill, a golden foot in the mouth award. You know, someone just told me they met the new president of our school. We have a new president, and he's telling me in his basement office, I put my foot in my mouth, and I go, you got a long way to go. I have the award. You have to take it away from me. Okay. And I say the workplace, it must provide this to foster a setting in which vocation will flourish. Vocation won't flourish if everything is top down. We found that out because our last president was someone very hierarchical, did some great things for the school. But one of the great things that didn't get done was a sense of empowering people, I want to say in the trenches, empowering the people that get the teaching done, because everything came top down and everybody needed permission all the way through the pipe to the top. Okay? Environmental stewardship again plays a role, but I like the part where I like to think that if I have a gift in a particular area that I want to know when it's good to use that and when it's not good or appropriate to use that in a sense. And I'd like my pastor to weigh in on that. Yeah, I'm selfish that way, and I think the generations that are coming now are not feeling like they're getting that. Not because the church doesn't want to provide it again. I don't think that we've been asking for it, and the working world kind of now has changed to a place where we are. Okay? And the last thing I think is really critical is this person in the George Fox thesis said that we need a sense of church as community. All the working places have not integrated community per se as yet, or again, as work gets very, very specialized, and we see this in academia. You can know a lot about little, you can be wide and shallow, or you can be thin and deep. So if you become specialized in a particular area, you can quickly get lost in the community. But what is your role? Your role is to transfer science to people, but if you know everything about nothing, as soon as you hit your area, nobody knows more than you, but outside of that, you know nothing. It's very easy to lose your sense of where you live in the community. So when jobs are becoming specialized, we lose this connection with others, which a lot of reports are referring back to the Latin imago Dei, the image of God. In the image of God, we're fully defined, we're fully divine. We attain a certain essence of our divine nature when we think of ourselves as one amongst many and not isolated. Okay? And this is where I like that analogy with a symphony. Every time a symphony plays differently. And a symphony gets better when everybody inside it gets better, but you don't overpower one another. Okay? You have different roles in a symphony, and it all clicks in communion with how it acts together. Okay? Business thinking can sometimes be short-term, contractual, very hierarchical. The flatter we get, okay? The flatter we get, in some sense, the more faith at ministries at work can work well. This is something I can't speak to as much. I have had some conflict at work, but conflict between unspiritual business practices and Christian calling, the example I gave you of my brother, is really, really hard. It's really hard. What do you do when you feel like you're either going to go to jail if you get found out, or you have to hide something that you're doing that you don't believe in doing, or you can't do your job because that's what you're told to do? Okay? Another key thing about church is community. If my brother were hearing this message in church every week, he would have left his other 2 jobs earlier. That's not an easy thing to do. I've had moments when I consider that, and I applied for other jobs, and one of them is to work at a more religiously minded university. But there are times and places where if we have the faithfulness, it will guide whether our working world is too incompatible with how we want to live. One thing I found really interesting is several pieces of work talked about how the amount of work you can do in the world is unlimited. So when you hear like nobody ever died saying, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. The amount of work that you can do is unlimited. You can spend all your time at work. And the amount of wealth you can develop, especially in this country, is unlimited. And I have friends who are actually called socialists for this. I'm called a closet socialist for this, and I'm told never to mention that word, but I just did. Oops, sorry. But here's an instance. But beyond a certain point, and Lorna showed me a great video, and I probably don't have time to show it, but maybe I'll get one audio clip from it. It's called the concept of gross national happiness. That in Bhutan, they're trying to make people in the country productive but happy, and gross domestic product doesn't measure people's contentedness. And contentedness sometimes comes from lack of conflict between what you believe and what you do. Okay? And they all say the same thing. Beyond a certain point, wealth doesn't help the communal good. So this is a place where if you're all out for yourself, you can lose sight of this. You become so specialized that making more money beyond a certain point. It's easy at some point to not check yourself and say, beyond here, it doesn't really serve the community. It only serves me. Okay? That's just an area where the church can have something to say. I think we would like to keep the communal good as a higher priority than just the personal good. But if you get to that place, you're living just fine usually, okay? But the communal good maybe suffers beyond a certain point. So those are the 3 things. Do you have a scriptural understanding? Do you hear somebody say, by virtue of the Bible, this is a good thing to do? Can you take that to your place of work and have the authority to do that in terms of your responsibilities? And then how does it serve the greater good? Okay. So what actions can we take? I don't know. Again, I don't have answers. But one thing I can just talk about what's helped people in instances I know, and developing core principles, having some kind of mission statement. I'll do this. I'm not going to lie to get a contract. I mean, but have a more basic one on top of that. That's an umbrella concept is helpful. Seek your calling no matter what your job title. Again, it can sometimes seem flippant for me to say this. To go, I would expect someone would walk up to me afterward and say, okay, that's easy for you to say, but. Okay, but one thing to keep in mind is there are essences in which we can be who we're meant to be, even though, and we can use it to advance our responsibilities at work, but there's still a disconnect, I know, but this is a place you could start. I oftentimes say I understood this a lot, seeking spiritual guidance. I don't feel like I ask for it enough, and maybe until we ask, we won't necessarily get it. Meaning, I would love to hear a sermon that tells me exactly what I need to do tomorrow and Monday, so I don't live in this gut-wrenching, stomach-turning model that I don't look forward to Monday morning in my committee meetings. Okay? Emulate servant leaders. I get to see this a little bit from some leaders, not at all from others, but there's a lot of negativity, backstabbing, and poisonous people at work. Okay? The Desiderata, which I have hanging in my bedroom, says, look to be on good terms as much as possible with all people, but avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. For the most part, try to get along with everybody. But when there are people who are going to task you to be so different than being right, then avoid that, okay? Develop positive relations with everyone. Own up to your mistakes, but stick to those principles. Take your responsibility, and if you don't like the culture, aim to be a change agent. And that's not by revolution. A lot of times it's by evolution. Okay, so I'm going to just ask two interesting things. I saw a good example. At Direct Supply, the CEO said their number 1 guiding principle is the employee comes first. He goes, you'll never hear that from a company, the employee comes first. He goes, but I let my employees know that if they're in a disagreement with with a customer, that if I understand my employee's point of view, they will understand the customer's point of view. He finds out that it funnels down to the employee being taken care of the best way. And Michael Cudahy has a set of rules, okay, where he says never make an org chart, it just makes people feel left out. Have a love affair with your employees and let them do their own thing. That doesn't sound like where I work all the time. But I do have a nest in my office. I don't paint it pink, but people don't come in my office and say it looks like a typical office. As long as I can get away with that. If I feel like I'm effectively working because I feel like it's an extension of my home is where I feel comfortable. A lot of people call their church their Sunday home, where they feel comfortable. In any way, shape, or form you can take that to work, it makes work a better place. So, I probably talked too much, but I would like to have a session, and I'm going to tell Sue, where I can have it be much more interactive and have people tell stories and then relate them back to some of these principles.
Thank you.
Thank you.